Howdy, folks. My name is Alex, otherwise known as Fear the Z. Welcome to episode 51 of the Churner's Digest. As always, I'll start with a disclaimer. I'm not a financial or tax advisor. This is not financial or tax advice. This is for entertainment purposes only, but please enjoy. Today, I have the former co-founder and CEO of Enzo Wealth with me, Jeremy Shoykhet. I recorded this episode a few days ago and wanted to just give a little preamble to it. I did want to say a disclaimer right at the top that while Jeremy did have access to these questions prior, I just gave him a list of questions I was giving to him just so he knew it was coming ahead of time and didn't have any questions that he wasn't comfortable asking. He did not have any editorial input on what questions would be asked and actually didn't ask me to remove any questions. So he was a great guest, and this is kind of the 50th episode special that I wanted to do. So hopefully if you guys enjoy these interviews, then we'll do ones in the future. I know there's a certain app that gives good deals on maybe gift cards that people might want to hear. So I'll try to reach out to them and see if there's something there. But without further ado, we'll get right into our interview. Thanks, y'all. Enjoy. All right. Hello. Today I have with me Jeremy Shoykhet. Jeremy is the former co-founder and CEO of Enzo Wealth, whose goal was to make your money work for you. It started in late 2020 and shut down early in 2023 after garnering a large user base and getting featured on Doctor of Credit, mainly for their cashback offerings. I mean, I started talking back in like early January 2022 over email exchange. We discussed his product and we've kept in touch ever since. So Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to start off with, you want to tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, your experience?
Sure. Yeah, I spent most of my career in financial services. Began my career at an insurance company focused on the life insurance space. After that, I moved more into the investing world. Was working at a few different hedge funds. And yeah, around the time of COVID, ended up getting more into the sort of entrepreneurial world. And then, from there, I ended up starting Enzo. And obviously we had, that journey for a few years. That's kind of my background.
Awesome. This is a question that I had for later, but I feel like it's natural here. It was a listener question from Bleak Choo Choo. What are you up to now after Enzo? I know that ended, like I said, around early 2023. So what have you been keeping yourself busy with?
Yeah, so I'm working at an investment firm focused on investments across public and private markets, a lot still in financial services, a lot in sort of the banking world, as well as across sort of insurance and some stuff, still touching on fintech and other sort of early stage investments.
Awesome. Thanks. And you mentioned fintechs in general, so I kind of want to dive into that. Can you tell me exactly like why you started Enzo and what drew you to fintechs as a business in general?
Yeah, I guess I started to see some of the neobank models that were starting to emerge, and I thought it was a really interesting space. Obviously, everyone who uh, interacts with the financial system in the U.S. has some sort of a bank account in some format. So it's something we're all familiar with. And I remember the first bank account when I was maybe in high school, like Wells Fargo account, and I've always been unimpressed, I guess, with the consumer experience. And I've always been, sort of an aficionado for great technology products and just well-designed products in general. And I think when you look at a lot of these banking products that are, sort of the dominant platforms, whether it's the large sort of money center banks or what have you, the experiences feel like they're out of 2005, which because they frankly are. And I think I'd read a lot, and when you look at like the early founding story of PayPal, actually, what they really set out to be was like an all-in-one sort of money center for all of your financial needs. So investing, banking, payments. And so I felt like that opportunity was still there. And I think that opportunity is still there. And I think if you look at what Elon has talked about publicly with his goals for Twitter and now X, a lot of it is he still wants to do the same thing. And I think it's amazing that it's one of the few things where there was a business plan to do it 20 years ago and no one's done it. And it's still viable today. And so I think I just saw a massive market where I felt like the consumer was not getting a great experience, and there was an opportunity to build just a great way for you to manage your money across investing, saving, spending, etc., and to be like sort of a service first bank in the way that maybe people who are a little bit higher on the net worth totem pole tend to get very great client service. And I felt like a lot of the people who were sort of up and comers and younger people who were, starting to build wealth, but maybe not quite there yet, were not getting that level of service. And maybe there was an opportunity to do that.
That's great. Yeah. Would you say that like it sounds like Enzo's main goal was to give those customers who didn't have that large net worth the opportunity for that enhanced banking that those large network individuals did normally have? Would you say that's kind of what Enzo was going for?
Yeah, and I think, look, it was very much targeting people who were, sort of building their net worths and sort of, aspirational folks or who are in the kind of Henry category, if you will. And I think the unfortunate reality of banking is that it's really difficult to serve someone who only has a very small sort of balance, in the sense that there's not a lot you can do for them. And then also it's difficult to make money. Obviously, you have, fixed costs in a banking product. So you do need some minimum level of kind of viability to work with that customer. And so I think part of it was, hey, these folks, even if they, are, let's say, smaller investors today, they're going to grow over time. And, maybe it's someone like yourself who's, earlier in their career, closer to earlier than later in their career. And so as you grow, it's like, okay, you grow and we grow and we grow together. So I think that was what we saw as the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I remember us discussing early on in the stages of Endo, at least when I was involved, and I think that aligns a lot with what you guys were going for. Um, what do you think was Enzo's downfall? I mean, I know that the space changed a lot towards the tail end of like 2023, so or really early off in 2023. So I'm curious what you saw as your pain points and what was difficult for y'all to really get off the ground.
Yeah, I think our pain points were, one, we didn't maybe think enough about the revenue model in the early days. And I think we had sort of a long tail plan of, we wanted to have investing and sort of banking combined. And I think, we launched initially with the banking product, which is probably the lowest margin product, versus like investing is obviously tends to be a little bit higher margin, because most investing models are kind of tied to some sort of fee or commission structure, whereas banking products are almost, for the most part, free to some extent, or with minimum balances, they're waived, right, fees. So it's tougher to start like that. I think probably just maybe we didn't appreciate, and there's some naivete of trying to tackle such a big market and say, okay, we're going to take on Chase. It's sort of a, aggressive thing to do when you're starting a business, and, going after large companies that have billions of dollars of capital they could spend per year, just in research or marketing or whatever. And maybe being a little bit naive about the sort of gargantuan task. And I think maybe we could have been a little more focused, I think, to start, so being a little bit more precise with our target audience and the exact features we were going to, serve them with, and our exact kind of model for how we were going to do it, versus being a little bit more open-ended. So I think that was part of it. I mean, obviously the fundraising market, became a lot tougher. And I think what we began to see was, unfortunately, the amount of capital that might be required to kind of continue on with our vision was going to be, hard to come by. And just given that, unfortunately, the winds kind of turned against us, and in the fundraising market, especially for fintech. And I think it's kind of like when you set off on a sailboat, and then all of a sudden you get a little bit away from shore, and then there's there's sort of a big storm that comes out of nowhere, and it kind of spins you in a different direction. So I think that was part of it. And I think when you've looked at some of the competing products, unfortunately, most of them have kind of gone in the similar direction. I mean, I know we spent a lot of time tracking a few of the others, and I think a lot of them have since also sunset. And so I think it wasn't something that was like unique to us. I think it was kind of an industry-wide secular thing, and it's just tough to compete. And I think in the U.S. regulatory environment, unfortunately, it's gotten tougher for fintechs, because there's been a bit of a crackdown, if you will, on kind of the regulatory side, and these relationships that banks have with fintechs. And so it's just difficult. And I think, it's a highly regulated market, and um, there's a lot of incumbency advantage. And, Whether that's a good thing or not, like personally, I don't think it is, but that's kind of the system that we're in, and so for better or worse, in sort of the American banking system, it is sort of highly regulated, and it makes it a bit more challenging to be a tech company that wants to partner with a bank. And, obviously there are like a lot of reasons for why that's the case. And it's very important to protect the safety and soundness of the banking system. And so, I fully understand why there are a lot of those restrictions. And I think, protecting consumers is really important, paramount. Um, but some of those restrictions, there's probably a fine balance there, and some of them make it tough for sure to be a fintech and technology company that wants to offer banking services. And so and I think I'm sure maybe if some of your listeners and you have seen, obviously there's been some recent drama with some of the fintech banks. And so, seeing how it can go wrong makes you appreciate why those protections are in place. But, in some certain circumstances, some of them can be sort of a hindrance when you're trying to do things that are maybe innovative, or maybe offer a better consumer experience than kind of what the big banks are offering, if you will.
Yeah, you touched a lot of great things there. So I kind of want to double click on a few of them. You mentioned the kind of regulations and some fintechs having issues. Are you privy to the Evolve Bank and Trust situation? Is that what you're referencing, like the middleman with Synapse Brokerage and Synapse LLC?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been loosely following it just as an outside observer. I have no interactions with any of those companies or any of the individuals involved. Just as someone obviously who's followed fintech, I've been interested in it, and I've been just following loosely from afar some of the developments. And obviously, it's very unfortunate to see some of the customers without the ability to access their money. And that was something for me when we were building out Enzo. I always saw that as paramount. It was sort of customers first, and then obviously I wanted our company to do well as well. But I always saw it as the customer comes first. And when someone entrusts you with their money, and even though at Enzo the money was stored with the bank, but the extent that we were facilitating that connection, I always saw that as something very important, and that drove a lot of our decision making, where we were very hesitant, and we chose not to offer any sort of uh, cryptocurrency offerings. Or a lot of folks at one point or another were doing sort of DeFi, some of these yield farming things, and we deliberately avoided all of those because I didn't feel comfortable with the risk and didn't want to introduce our customers to those types of risks. So it's something we always took very seriously, because I think someone's money is serious business. And obviously you never want to be in a position where people aren't able to pay their rent or pay their expenses due to some oversight you had. I always saw that as something far worse than if someone doesn't get their DoorDash delivery on time. I just obviously that's unfortunate too, but I just thought the degree of seriousness was one level higher than hey, someone's pasta came cold.
Yeah, absolutely. And I somehow like really know how to pick them because I've been exposed to the Voyager downfall. I've been exposed to the FTX downfall, and I've been exposed to the Evolve Bank and Trust situation with Juno. I think they still have like $4,000 of mine locked up. Um, is there anything that you saw? I mean, I've covered it pretty decently on the show, this whole situation with Synapse. Was there anything that you thought was interesting, or um, something that a lot of people you think don't know about the space or what's happened there that you want to touch on?
Nothing in particular. I mean, look, I think it's a challenging situation. I think banking is about trust, and ultimately, whether you're investing with someone or they're storing your money, it's kind of the same, and it's a partnership. And I think when you study the history of banking, that's what it used to be. In the olden days, there was wildcat banking, and there were actually different banks would issue their own currencies, actually. And there were issues at various points in time in the US, well before the Federal Reserve, and they standardized everything. And that's actually why they did. But sometimes banks, they would say, okay, we've taken in $1 million in deposits, and they would just issue a bunch of extra notes. And so they would essentially devalue, right, or inflate their own currency. And so there'd be certain banks where you're like, oh, I won't trust that, where I'll discount it by 90% because they've actually issued all this currency. So, you have to be careful with that relationship. I think it's difficult to say. Obviously, in hindsight, it's easy to say, but I think just an unfortunate circumstance, and hopefully all of the customers are made whole as best as is possible. And it's unfortunate to see, I think, because the when you look at the US bankruptcy process, it's not really designed to resolve a situation like that. And unfortunately, like even if I followed the FTX situation, for example, and it's almost ironic because I think the process was so slow that a lot of the people ended up doing better off than they would have, because cryptocurrency prices recovered. But it wasn't really anything deliberate by the trustees or anything like that. It was just they waited so long that the market kind of went back up. And I think part of it was the market went down in anticipation of this wave of selling that they expected, which I think was ultimately correct. It's just that the process was so slow that the selling didn't materialize in the time frame that people expected, and then the market sort of rebounded. So I think that's unfortunate, and I've seen some of those letters that people have written to the judge. It's tough because U.S. bankruptcy system, it ultimately, I think it works out over the long term, at least usually for companies. I think it's more difficult when it's sort of this weird banking thing where it's a tri-party relationship where the bank itself is sound and is not in any trouble. And I think like the company obviously is bankrupt, and so the bankruptcy trustee is sort of saying, well, look, like I can't compel necessarily the bank to do anything, and it's almost like unfortunate where everyone's kind of like playing hot potato, and no one really knows who's sort of at fault. And obviously the people you feel the worst for are the customers because they're kind of sitting there and they haven't gotten their funds. They have no information when their funds may or may not be available. And, I think, unfortunately, when you have a banking relationship, you hope that you're protected by the FDIC. And I think, from the FDIC's perspective, if there's no bank failure, they don't really see it as their purview, which, is kind of, I think, the way the rules are written. So, I don't know if that means that they should or shouldn't do anything, but it is unfortunate. And I think one of the questions people will be asking is, what does that mean for the future of these types of products? Because the unfortunate precedent might be that, hey, look, if a fintech fails, it's not so clear that the FDIC will step in, which is tricky. And I think, look, if you're using some of these products, you just have to be careful. And, I would say, I would recommend to anyone that I think, that you're just careful and judicious with your how much of your portfolio you're putting in any one thing. And I think you want to look at it, no different than an investment in certain respects where, you don't put all of your eggs in any one basket. Just like how a company, you wouldn't have just one supplier for one of your products. You want to ensure that, you have fail safes so that if for whatever reason that company has issues, you're not like sort of, out of luck.
Those are really great points and really good suggestions from you. This is a really interesting point you made about the selling of the assets when they're getting back to the customers who are made whole again. So it's really interesting. And I also read some of those letters to the judge, and they're really heartbreaking. And I hope that situation also gets resolved. I know that Voyager is kind of almost made whole. I think they've redistributed 75% of their assets. And I know FTX is in the final stages of at least their first redistribution. And you mentioned a few things involving these banks. And there was I don't know if you're familiar with, I think it's Jason Maluka runs a kind of like weekly blog called FinTech Business Weekly, and they did a fantastic
Mhm.
job of covering a lot of these fintech happenings. So if I've referenced them before in the past, and definitely recommend checking them out. And you did also mention like the FDIC and their role in this. I know that they recently issued some new regulations around how the terminology on websites should be calling out their partnerships for particular banks and fintechs. Hopefully that does a good job of helping customers as well.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully it does. And I think like the unfortunate thing about stuff like this, and when you have the FTX situation is that sometimes it takes one of those to kind of make people aware of the risk. I think it's like kind of um, when you read about in the summer someone getting bitten by a shark, it's always unfortunate, but sometimes it just makes people aware of, hey, there's danger potential, and I think that's just a risk to be cognizant of, and it's just something you got to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing your insights on that. If you want to bubble back to Enzo, earlier you mentioned some other players in the space, and I can't help to relate Enzo to sort of Ness or Nesswell, if you're familiar with them. Their CEO is Derek Flanbrake, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He recently did a podcast episode where he discussed their happenings, and it's the first time he spoke publicly about their downfall. And I know that he talked about how as well as what you mentioned with the long-term plan of Enzo and being better about forecasting, and especially with the space changing. It sounds like y'all were in a very similar situation as to his. I don't know if you're familiar with Nest at all or their product.
I followed it. I actually wasn't aware that they had shut down, and it's unfortunate to hear. I always thought it was an interesting product. But yeah, I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, I think it's a challenging market, and unfortunately, not the success rate hasn't been that high.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm curious. I'm always curious about the finances of a fintech, and I think we've discussed a little bit this on this past. But I was curious if you had like an idea of like what a cost of a customer acquisition for Enzo was, and what like a fixed cost of having a user was. I know you mentioned like having minimum fund requirements. Some banks do that in order to offset some of those fees that it just costs to have a customer. And I don't think a lot of listeners or people think of like just having an account, even just sitting at a certain balance, does cost the bank some kind of money. I was curious if you had any insights into that.
Yeah, so I mean, just to just speak generally about it, what I would say is that um, there's kind of the variable and fixed costs, like any business, and most community banks, and well, all banks, they have a ledger system, right? And so they're using core provider software. And I can't speak to the large banks, and I don't know their relationships, but when you look at a typical kind of community bank, if you will, they tend to pay their core provider, a sort of a fixed monthly fee per user. So it actually, even though in theory all a bank account is, and Elon talks about this a lot, it's just a ledger. It's just so it's okay. You have X dollars stored here, compute the interest. So if you really wanted to, if you study the history of kind of money, um, banks actually began with people trading wheat, and they would say, okay, I'm going to loan you some wheat, and I have wheat on deposit with you, and I'll get interest. So I gave you 2 bushels, and then, in a month, I get whatever it is, 3 bushels or whatever the rates of interest were. But obviously, in the modern times with software and technology, banks have to pay this cost in terms of sort of the ledger core provider cost. So that's like a per account cost. Generating statements, has a cost. Onboarding users has a cost because there's various providers that you have to use to do know your customer and comply with the anti-money laundering regulations. And so, just to speak roughly, and again, this is just a rough number, but I would say for most banks, it's probably costing at least $40 to $60 a year just to have a customer.
Wow.
And then, with that also comes there are various sort of overhead costs that you kind of have to allocate, right? So if you have let's say you have a small bank and you have 10,000 customers, and you have, 3 or 4 customer service representatives, right? And so let's say that costs you a few $100,000 a year in aggregate. So there's some degree of, okay, well, you have to allocate that cost as well. So when you add up all these different costs of like, okay, the bank has to pay their core provider, and another one is just to issue a debit card that has a cost. And I'm not aware of that many banks that charge, at least on the first issuance of the debit card. Maybe they'll charge you for replacement, but that has a cost too. So there's various like one-time costs just to onboard a user. That could be $10, $20. Probably could be $40 to $60 a year of just kind of fixed operational costs to have that user. Um, And then when you look at it, most bank accounts, which again, the large money center banks are starting to actually charge per month for an account if you don't keep a minimum balance in there. But for a lot of fintechs, you're saying, hey, we want to provide this great product. We're not really charging, or maybe your base tier doesn't have any costs. So, you have to figure out a way to bridge that gap. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah,
And on
especially
the
when you
acquisition
consider.
side, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and then when you talk about the acquisition of customers, that can cost anywhere from hundreds to $200 and maybe more. So you have this thing where it costs you $200 to bring in the customer. It costs you another maybe $10 to onboard them and give them their first debit card, send that in the mail, and then you're spending $50 a year to keep them on the system. And then it's like, okay, well then now you need to obviously figure out how to get that payback cost.
And those customer acquisition, especially when if you offer something like a sign-on bonus, you incite getting customers like myself who aren't exactly here for the products, but are here for a quick and dirty get in, hit them for their bonus, and get out.
Yeah, so actually what I would say about sign-up bonuses and the reason people still do them is in a way they can actually be cheaper than just spending on Instagram or Facebook ads. And the reason is because to spend on Facebook ads, you spend and you spend and you spend, and maybe after the 30th time you saw the ad, you're like, okay, I'll download the ad. Um, the challenge with banking is it's not really a high intent kind of product to find out about. Most people, the difference between the US and the rest of the world is that most, people who especially are, let's say, working professionals have a bank account already. So you're usually not like desperate for an account. And so you might say, you know what, this one looks cool, I'll use it. But it's like such a thing that you're not like nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, I really need a new bank account today. You do wake up and say, oh, I really have to book this travel or this flight or hotel. So it's sort of like a low intent thing. And it takes a lot of really beating someone over the head to say, okay, you ought to try us to build the brand. So I think sign up bonuses can be really effective because everyone is motivated by free stuff. I think I don't care who you are, everyone loves free stuff or a deal. Um, and so if you say, hey, you'll get $50 for doing this, not everyone will do that, but a lot of people will. And the other thing that you tend to find is you'll also tell your friends. So if you open a new bank account, you're probably not going to tell your friends about it. It's sort of a weird, a personal thing. But if you got $25 for free and it took you 10 minutes, you'll probably tell like three or four of your friends. And so there's like a very big viral component to them. Um, the issue is that when you give away money for free or give away anything for free, there's always fraud and there's always kind of a misbehavior, if you will. So you have to be careful about that. But it tends to be actually a very effective way to kind of get the initial word out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't really thought of it as like a viral thing, and you're totally right. It definitely is, especially with like word of mouth, getting to friends, and that's kind of the best way to advertise a product is to just get someone who is already in there to establish it with their friend. And that's where these like even referral bonus is super valuable as well, just to try and get people because people trust people that they know to give them a good recommendation. They'd rather get that than an Instagram ad, for example, like you said.
Yeah, and I think actually when you study the history of PayPal, they did the same thing. And this was in the 2000s. They were just giving away money for free, and it was basically like if your friend signs up, you each get $15 or something like that. And I think they were losing millions of dollars a month actually because
Wow.
they were growing like crazy, and they were doing this, and that was like in the early days of the internet. So, I think it was true then. It's still true now, and I think human behavior doesn't change that much.
And pivoting a little bit, I guess actually sort of related. You mentioned PayPal, and I know that Enzo for a period was offering it was like 2% cash back on purchases through PayPal. I think it was considered like other categories from what I remember. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, this I guess secret to that, if you will, is there's really not that much of a secret. I think when they first launched their bill pay product, the way that they were charging kind of cards, did it as a purchase. And so I think for whatever reason, across the processor, however it was being handled by PayPal, we had no relationship with them. So I think, however, they had structured it on their side of the system was actually charging it as sort of a purchase. And I think over time, maybe they started to see that they were spending a lot. in interchange fees, and so I guess they may have figured out how to code that a bit differently on their end, and that ultimately drove down the interchange. But for that period of time, I think it was really just, I don't know if it was an oversight on their part or it's just something that, was a misconfiguration. I'm not totally sure if it was like a glitch, or maybe it was something that they were comfortable doing initially to kind of get the word out there about PayPal Bill Pay. I really have pretty limited visibility into it, but it was something that was kind of flowing through our systems, and so we were happy to provide it for customers, as per the terms of our cashback rewards.
Yeah, and that speaks volumes to Enzo's goal to really have this product that's really great for their customers. I mean, believe it or not, from what I understand, PayPal Bill Pay really started catching on with Enzo from at least from my exposure to it. That's at least where the first time I heard it. And believe it or not, it's still going very strong with a lot of communities. There's still viable options for certain debit cards that pay for certain bill pay transactions, paying off like your credit card balances through it, or paying off even like your mortgages or I know some people do like car loans. There's even some people that like create bots to pay off certain bills in like dollar increments because their system allows for it and they can get more cash back from it. So from what I understand, Enzo was kind of the start of it. So that's something that's definitely lived past Enzo's life.
Awesome, great to see. And yeah, look, to all the churners out there, keep on doing it. I think, by all means, I think if there's the opportunity to do it, and as long as you're, sort of following the applicable rules, and why not? Sort of free money out there, might as well take it.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking about the debit card a little bit, I'm someone who like has this weird obsession with like collecting debit cards in a way. And Enzo is one that I have in my collection. It's one of those that like you obviously can't get anymore. I don't know if you still have your Enzo debit card kicking around somewhere. I know I do, filed away.
I do, yeah. I kept it, I guess, as sort of a memento.
And I'm always curious about like the behind the scenes of what's involved with getting like and Enzo's card wasn't exactly the most flashy design, but you have to have a design team or at least someone come up with a product and the design of the image, as well as getting it onboarded to things like digital wallets. Do you have any insights into what's involved with that? That's always curious. That's always had me curious thinking about how what's involved with that.
Yeah, so I mean, we had a product designer who did almost all of our design work. He also worked with an outside designer that we had also had as a consultant. He did a great job on that. They both did. Um, yeah, I think the card networks have certain requirements around what the card can look like. Um, so that's across Visa and Mastercard. And they have like a variety of sort of things. One is around your logo, around having like the Visa or Mastercard logo, certain colors, like so and they will only approve certain things. So there is sort of like a defined sandbox you can play in. Um, and then in terms of the wallets and kind of the Apple Pay stuff, a lot of that's kind of handled through the card processor. So usually that's sort of a very functional thing and pretty perfunctory. Um, but yeah, I mean, so I think it's just kind of there's certain requirements, and you do have some flexibility within those, but you have to kind of stick to the guidelines. And um, I think there's also unfortunately limitations around the actual card printers. A lot of them can't print in like a very high res way that maybe you would wish. So I think unfortunately we had tried a lot of cool and novel concepts, but when we went to look at the sort of the actual cards put out, it didn't look like anything on the computer screen. So I think that's probably the answer for why most debit cards and credit cards look kind of boring. It's just because when you're printing, especially like it tends to be plastic, right, or some kind of a hybrid plastic. Just the way the resolution in the printer is like it novel designs don't really look very good on it. And so it's just sort of the unfortunate reality or sort of one of the things about, the difference, I guess, between the art and the actual execution of the art.
Yeah, and I love calling it art because it truly is art. Someone went into taking the time to design this. logo or image and how it's being used by a whole bunch of customers. And I also find it interesting that having these limitations of what the card can be. So if they're, for example, it adds a little bit of impactfulness to cards that do manage to get some kind of intrinsic design in there of like someone had to go through the process of trial and error of seeing what actually looks good on it. Because as you mentioned, there's plenty of cards that I have that look totally different compared to their digital wallet version compared to the physical image version, whether it be due to these limitations that you mentioned or what have you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think we actually had an original idea where we wanted to partner with an artist to have them build like a custom art piece and kind
Oh
of
wow.
actually also print like sort of a reproduction of that artwork on the card. But we just found that all of the artworks, like it just didn't really look good on the card, and it was tough to actually implement. So obviously, some things are good ideas, but it's all in the execution, and sometimes things are just not practical.
Yeah. That's all the questions that I personally had. I know we had some listener questions that I wanted to quickly go through here. These are definitely more Enzo focused, so I'm really curious to hear your answers. I know when Enzo was around, you'll use the formula to establish what your interest would be. And these questions are from Bleak Choo Choo, so thank you very much to him for submitting these questions. But he was wondering why you think no other fintechs or banks have followed this kind of model where you have a public facing formula to easily calculate what the bank's interest rate will be.
Truthfully, I have no idea. I don't know. There's no real reason why you can't. I think maybe banks like to have the flexibility and um, there's certainly an element. If you go look at any publicly traded bank, they'll tend to talk about what is their deposit beta. And so what that means is, okay, when interest rates go up, how much of that are they passing through to the customer? That's sort of their like fractional amount that they're passing on to the customer. And so perhaps some of that is, hey, if interest rates go up, they would like to obviously maintain some of that for profitability. So there might be some component of that where, hey, sometimes you don't make things very transparent because you don't want them to, in the same way that, when you go to the grocery store, they don't list the profit margin on a lot of the products. And some of them it's because they're making 90%, and maybe others they're not. And so I think there's probably some component of that. Maybe also just they want the flexibility to choose what to do. So whether they end up passing that through or not, um, that's probably part of it. And I think the other part is like maybe the average person doesn't really follow the Fed that much. And so maybe people kind of roughly know, okay, interest rates have been rising, or now obviously they're falling. But I think the average person doesn't wait around for those Fed meetings and look at those dot plots and stuff. So maybe the average person is happy enough to just know, okay, it's 3%, and they kind of have a sense, okay, rates are going down a little bit. So maybe I would expect that to go down a little bit, and maybe they're not following it that closely. So, I think there's probably not that many people in the world that kind of like aggressively follow the Federal Reserve developments, and most of those people are traders or other sort of interest rate watchers, and so there's probably some element of just, hey, it's one of those things where sometimes it's easier to just add a layer of simplicity on top of something. So not telling someone how the sausage gets made and just saying, okay, this is your rate, 3%. But yeah, I mean, I liked the transparency, and I thought it was always interesting, and sort of seemed like a fun thing for the customers to be able to say, okay, well, if the Fed does this, it goes to this, and if the Fed does that, it goes to that. And I think having that formula, some people liked it, but yeah, it's interesting. I guess no one else has really taken that model. I haven't seen it much elsewhere.
Yeah, I haven't either, and I couldn't agree more. I think that the value add might not really be there for like majority of customers. So most banks probably just don't even see the value in adding it. I think another question, there's two more here that I want to ask. Big Choo Choo was curious, be able to do it all again, what would you have done differently versus the same respecting to maximum AUM, which is assets under management? And honestly, I don't really know what that question means. So if you could kind of explain if you know what that means and if you have an answer to it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, my understanding of what he's asking, is sort of about just maximizing the amount of dollars on the platform. What I would say is it's always difficult to kind of think about how would you have done something differently. Because I think you always think, well, if I would have just done X, and maybe it would have worked out in a certain fashion. But the world doesn't really work like that. And I think sometimes, if you would have said, okay, well, if we would have just done this, maybe it would have, I don't know, maybe it would have worked out even worse. You never know. So I think it's difficult to say. I would have been maybe a little more precise with our targeting. I would have been more deliberate with like which exact customers we wanted and just really hone in on a smaller community, I think, and be like more, instead of being something for a lot of different people, maybe just be one really great thing for a smaller audience. And maybe being a little more aggressive with trying to pursue growth. I think um, we had some interesting ideas that we started out with that and some of them have taken hold. Like we were pretty early on the rent cashback concept. There are a number of other cards that have taken that and really taken it pretty far. So I think maybe we could have been more aggressive and kind of leveraging the ideas we had and just really pursuing them aggressively. Like we probably tried many different things. I would have tried fewer things and just been a little more precise in the execution of those things instead of, I know we at varying points tested out a lot of different ideas, and I think it's always good to experiment, but not at the cost of doing a bunch of things poorly, or doing a bunch of things maybe in a mediocre fashion. So if I were to do it over, I would probably say, what's our best top three ideas, and just really aggressively and obsessively pursue them.
And if I remember correctly, I think Enzo, in addition to offering rent cashback, wasn't it also like mortgage? You could flag a ACH transaction as like a payment to your mortgage, and that could also be used as the
Yeah,
cashback.
we did.
Yeah, from what I know, that still isn't done anywhere else in the industry. I know Built has also had some woes on their sides with their partner Wells Fargo, and just to show how difficult it is to have something rewards in that space. So it really speaks volumes to what Enzo was able to do as a small player in the game for as long as they did. Um, and then finally, I did have another question. We were curious in terms of like having a Discord server. Do you think that there was a net positive or a net negative to having yourself in a Discord server, which speaking directly to customers?
I think it was, overall a great positive. I enjoyed meeting a lot of the folks, and I think we had a lot of great users who were interesting people. I learned a lot from, including yourself, and I enjoyed it. I think it's good. I think, it can be a little bit difficult where sometimes when you're in that position, uh, when you become friendly with some of the customers, sometimes if you have to deliver tough news, or if you have to, let's say, adjust the economic benefits that customers are getting, obviously it can be difficult because you're kind of disappointing people. And sometimes you
Totally.
have to do, when you're running a company, sometimes you have to make difficult decisions that customers may not be happy with, but maybe are necessary for the company, or you have no choice actually. Um, so that's always difficult, but I think on balance, it was really, really positive. And I think also you do have to be mindful of sometimes when you have a relationship with the customers of people being like overly focused on, well, I really want this because it would help me or because I would like it. And obviously, if you're building a product, you're building it for the broader audience, and so you need to kind of be mindful in your decision making, and you only have so much resources and how much features you can build. So you have to do stuff that kind of makes sense for like some sort of lowest common denominator, or some sort of median customer. So you can't just build for like a small contingent that may be really interested in a certain thing, but maybe it doesn't resonate with others. So there is that. That's probably the drawback, I would say, is it can distract a little bit, and sometimes you might build stuff that doesn't resonate with a broader audience. So I think that's just something you have to be mindful of on kind of the trade-off there. But overall, I think it's really helpful. It's great to have a sort of early loyal customers that are really interested in your product and care enough to give feedback. Like I think it's very valuable to get the real-time feedback. And I think you really want to just be iterating constantly and sort of running different experiments and making tweaks to the product and until you get it just right. So I think getting the feedback really quickly is super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, I was a member of the Discord server and we communicated on email. So I love having that communication with the bank and makes you feel like I have a personal connection. But I totally think you're right. And definitely get hyper fixated on one use case for one specific small subset of the user base when maybe that doesn't have that broad mass appeal that you're mentioning. And definitely those awkward situations where if your hands are tied and you kind of have to break news. I know like H and Bradley had very similar happenings where they had a private Discord community, and when things kind of turned down for them, the kind of members of H and Bradley kind of just go quiet because how are you supposed to field such negative feedback when you don't really have a
Mhm.
choice? The numbers don't make sense anymore. So you kind of have to just wind things down and kind of step back.
Yeah, I mean, it can be tough, and obviously, that's look when you take a position of responsibility. That's that comes with the chair. So that's just part of it, and I think it is what it is. But I think having to deliver bad news is never fun. But it's just one of those things where, yeah, sometimes obviously it's really fun to engage with the customers, and if it has to be that you deliver bad news, sometimes it can be tougher when you've developed somewhat of a friendly relationship with them. But that's just kind of how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all the questions I had, Jeremy. I did want to say that Enzo has definitely had a long lasting impact on the fintech space in general. So thank you for all your contributions. Like you've been fantastic, especially in my career growth and being able to discuss the product changes of Enzo. And I mean, the whole interest rate chasing aspect is something that really was instilled in me through Enzo. So huge shout out to the impacts that your company had and you've had since it's been created and its unfortunate downfall.
Sure. Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's been a pleasure to engage with you and some of the other customers. And uh yeah, it's been a great experience. And yeah, appreciate having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that you wanted to plug or anything you want to say what's next for you or something that is really at the front of your mind that is interesting you think the listeners would be interested in hearing about?
It's a good question. I don't think there's anything that jumps out at me. Yeah, I would say, for those of you that are out there maximizing the rewards, say keep at it. I think if there's sort of arbitrage to be had, you should pursue it.
It's a great way to put it. Jeremy, thank you very much for your time and thanks for being the inaugural interviewer on Turner's Digest. And thanks for your time as always. I really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, y'all.